And we are live. Thanks for tuning in again. Today we have a very special guest, Aaron Schatz. Thanks for coming on the show, Aaron.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, Aaron, I'm going to go through a little bit of your background. And so, you are the Chief Analytics Officer for the FTN network. You're the creator of DVOA, which I have a couple of questions about that I'm eager to hear your answer on. You are a writer for ESPN.com. You are a MVP All-Pro voter. You are kind of the mastermind behind footballoutsiders.com, which went online in July 2003. You are editor-in-chief of the book series Football Outsiders Almanac, used to be. And you spent 5 years on radio at WBRU Providence as a disc jockey and WKRO Daytona Beach as a music director.
Yep.
So I guess a good place for us to start would be prior to any of the things that I just listed out. Take me through your childhood a little bit, where you grew up, and then some of the things that fascinated you as a kid.
Lived in Southern California when I was little. Moved to Sharon, Massachusetts when I was 13. I was a big baseball guy. Big stats, baseball stats. Bill James, childhood math prodigy, loved baseball stats. I often talk about if only I had gotten obsessed with the stats on the financial page rather than the sports page, I would be a lot richer today. Went to Brown University in Providence, was an economics major there, but really majored in radio. WBRU is the Brown, used to be the Brown radio station that was a fully commercial radio station in a major market run by college students. So you got to experience, I did sports, I did news, I did DJing, I did morning show for a while. Like you get to experience what it's like to be a professional radio person. So I actually went into that after college. I went down to Daytona Beach, Florida, where I did nights and then I did middays and I was music director for a while. That didn't work out, so I came back north. Eventually, I found myself at the internet company Lycos, where I wrote a column called the Lycos 50 about what people search for on the internet. And while I was doing that, was when I sort of started Football Outsiders and got the idea to do some of these football stats. And there really were no football analytics at the time. There was a book called The Hidden Game of Football that I used as a, inspiration, but nobody was doing it really regularly on the internet. And we launched, like you said, July 2003, and really spread the word and got the word out there. The timing was perfect for me because Moneyball had just come out, and so everybody went looking for Moneyball in other sports, and there we were, this brand new site presenting analytics for football that nobody had really looked at before. So it really helped us grow in the first year or two. I lost my job at Lycos in February of 2004, and by September of 2004, I had enough work doing football analytics that I went off unemployment, and this has been my job ever since, is doing football analytics.
So you mentioned that before Football Outsiders, the analytics community didn't really exist. Back then there wasn't a lot of maybe statistics that people looked into. Certainly nothing like DVOA or some of the advanced statistics that we have now. You even look at what Amazon is doing with Thursday Night Football with their predictive AI, being able to predict who's blitzing, when are they blitzing, what position they're blitzing from. If you're to tell somebody,
dude, like when I started, there was no publicly available database of plays. I literally cut and pasted from ESPN into Excel and created a database of every play from the 2002 season.
Wow.
I started from scratch.
And so what was the initial, how was your work received initially?
Well, I sent it to some sports people that I knew through the Lycos connection. And everybody's response was basically, this is really interesting, but I don't think it would get a lot of readers. It's very niche. So that's when we decided I would just start my own site. And basically, I promoted it to baseball people. We tried to get attention in the first couple months, but when I really tried to get attention was November, because I was like, let's email every baseball analytics person you know and say, hey, we want you to know the world doesn't end at the end of October. Come read Football Outsiders and explore analytics for this other sport. So we spread from there.
So I have this little blurb that I read online, and I'd like to ask you about it. So there's a report out there that Football Outsiders was initially created because there was a Boston Globe reporter who said that the 0-2 Patriots failed to make the postseason because they could not establish the run. Is that true?
Well, that's when I mean, not Football Outsiders wasn't created because of that, but I started doing analytics in football because of that. I wanted to prove that Ron Borges was, well, not prove that he was wrong. I wanted to find out if he was right. I thought when I went counting, maybe I would find out he was right. Maybe I would find out he was wrong. But Bill James got his start just counting stolen bases by catcher from box scores in the Sporting News. And I'm like, I'm going to basically just do the same thing. Let's find out, do teams that run the ball more early in the game win more games? And of course, we all know now the answer is no. It's the other way around. Winning creates runs, not runs creates winning.
So talk to me a little bit about, you mentioned obviously Football Outsiders took off, analytics is where it is now, but you had a partnership with Fox Sports that kind of propelled, I would say, Football Outsiders to this new level of popularity. And so what, in your opinion, separated, I mean, I know you just said there wasn't a ton of competition for analytics at the time. It was this novel concept, but what do you think separated you from anybody else who was maybe looking into doing analytics full time?
Well, first of all, there weren't many. Second, I had this play-by-play database. So there were these guys who did a pro football prospectus book before I got started. And they wrote in their book, we have a play-by-play database. But then none of the stats that they did used the play-by-play database. So I was like, I'm going to actually use, I'm going to actually analyze things by play. And I'm going to analyze things in terms of situational football. I want my stats to think like a coach. The other thing is that I'm kind of a media whore. I mean, to be perfectly honest, the fact that I have a radio background and a sense of humor and that I'm good at putting my name out there and getting connections really helped. I mean, Greg Easterbrook used to write the Tuesday morning quarterback column at ESPN, and he got suspended. It's a long story. But we ended up having a contest to have our readers write his column for him. And then he ended up writing his column for my site in that first year when we were a little independent site. And that idea, that promotional idea, got us a lot of initial readership.
I want to double click on something just really quick because I was reminded of a question. And you mentioned having a radio background and how that's helped you in the world of media. I don't think you ever thought that maybe you'd be doing NFL analytics for a living, maybe back when you were at Brown, right? That probably never occurred to you. But looking back on it, all of your experience somehow tied together to create this perfect storm and put you in the position that you're in now. And so the reason I say this is because Steve Jobs had a quote once where I think he took a calligraphy class in college. And, at the time to him, it was like, oh, I'm just exploring my interests. I don't know where this is going to lead. But looking back on it, it was because of that calligraphy course that he essentially used that to create kind of the style and how, the style of the MacBooks and Apple and how everything looks so well put together. And so he talks about connecting the dots, where in the moment he doesn't really know what this is going to lead to, but looking back in time, he's able to connect the dots and say, okay, well, because of this experience and this experience, it adds up to create what I have now. How do you view that from your own kind of lens? And what would be your advice to somebody who's maybe early 20s looking to go into the world of sports?
Well, sure. I mean, the fact is, things that you would never think contributed to what happened contributed. Like, for example, when I went to Daytona Beach, Florida, the way that I stayed connected to New England, the way I stayed connected to home, was I went to a bar on Sundays and I watched Patriots games with other people from New England who were in Daytona Beach. And that's when I really fell in love with football in 1996, when the Patriots won the AFC and went to the Super Bowl. If I hadn't fallen in love with football at that point, I would have never thought to do football statistics, right? Because I was a baseball guy, strictly, as a kid. I never would have thought to do football statistics if not for that year in Florida. So, I mean, You know, here's the problem with giving advice to kids today about doing sports analytics, which is it's a very different world. You can't do what I did. You can't be first, right? Because I was
Right.
first.
Right.
I mean, the best advice I can give people today is there is a huge community online. I mean, mostly on Twitter, but hopefully, moving to threads a little bit as we all kind of get away from Twitter, of people doing really good work and just putting it out there. And the fact that all of this data is available through the NFL FastStar package makes it possible for anybody to do good analysis. And I would also really advise people to get involved in the big data bowl that the NFL puts on, because teams are hiring people straight out of that contest, and it is absolutely the way to get into it.
The big data bowl. I don't think I've heard of that. What is that specifically?
Every year, the NFL gives you some of their tracking data from the next gen stats from previous years and invites you to, this year it's about tackling. Last year, I think it was special. Last year was pass rush, I think, and the year before that was special teams. And they'd ask you to, ask a question about the subject and answer it and come up with a good stat formula. For example, the rushing yards above expected formula that Next Gen Stats uses, where they look at where all the blockers and defenders are at the time of the handoff and say, based on this handoff and this down and distance and where these players are, you would expect 6 yards. That all came from the first Big Data Bowl. That was the winner of the first Big Data Bowl.
What role do you think analytics, statistics play not only in football but in sports? Like if you had to define, I
Oh, I
guess,
mean, more and more, right? Like,
right.
they're never, look, the point is never to take over its sports. It's just to have some usefulness, right? The whole point of analytics is to make everybody smarter. If you're on a team, it's the point is to figure out how to win more games. Where are the advantages? If you're in the media, it's to figure out how to cover the game better and to better predict what's going to happen in the future. And, obviously analytics play a large role in every sport at this point.
Yeah. I have to ask you, my opinion, it's a hotly contested topic. And so fourth down, I think, I really started getting into football maybe 2011, 2010, 2011. I'm from the Bay Area, so a huge 49ers fan. Recently, people over the past couple of years have been grilling Shanahan for not going for it on fourth down enough, even though the analytics might tell him, hey, in this down and situation, you should go for it. Seemingly every game, there's one of those situations where a team is faced with going for it, punting, or kicking a field goal on fourth down. And there's always either a graphic that comes up that says, analytics says, you should go for this. Or the announcer will say, well, analytics says that 82% of the time you should go for this. Where do those numbers actually come from? And
models. Everybody's got a slightly different model, but you use past performance over the last few years to figure out just how often teams are going to convert. In a certain situation, those models are always keyed to the down and distance, but also the quality of the teams, right? Some of the models use a stat to figure out the quality of the teams, like ESPN's model uses their FPI. Some of the models use just the Vegas line to figure out the quality of the teams. But they all incorporate what the quality of the team is, and how often do you convert on this down and distance, and what's the likelihood that you are going to win if you convert, and what's the likelihood that you're going to win if you fail, and then what's the likelihood that you're going to win if you punt, and then they compare all those things.
So what, in your opinion, what else does a coach have to factor in? I mean, if the analytics tell him, right, hey, 84% of the time you should go for this, but maybe they don't go for it. Like what other factors do you think they think
They don't
about?
say go for this 84% of the time. They say if you go for this, you're going to win 60% of the time. And if you don't go for this, you're going to win 58% of the time. And so you have to decide. I mean, listen, people always talk about, but teams have to take their players into account. First of all, they talk about you have to take account your team's strengths and weaknesses. Models already take that into account. Then they say, you have to take into account the psychology of your players. That's true in the margins, right? If you have a toss-up where it says if you punt here, you'll win 59%. And if you go for it, you'll win 60%. And it's only a 1% difference. And you think, you know what? we're just not running against them today. This is just not a good day to do this, right? That's one thing. If the model says if you go for it, you're going to win 65% of the time, and if you punt, you're going to win 55% of the time, then it doesn't matter what your players think. You have to go for that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, as a fan, it's easy. It's also one of those things like, hindsight is 2020, and we as fans love to say, well, they should have done this in the moment or should have,
Coaches
right?
always say, but what if we don't? But what if we don't make it? But what if we don't get it? That's all incorporated into the models. Of course, there's a chance you're going to not make it. Like,
Right.
if we knew you were going to make it 100% of the time, you would go 100% of the time. Like, that's not like, it's factored into the model that we know sometimes you're going to get it and sometimes you're going to fail. Here's the thing. Going for it on fourth down is a higher variance than punting or kicking a field goal. But that means more good and it means more bad. And the good tends to outweigh the bad.
I haven't looked at the statistics, but off the top of your head, is there usually a correlation with a team's willingness to go for on fourth down and their success throughout the season or in the playoffs?
I mean, teams that go for it on fourth down win more, but there's so many things going on here that it's not like blatantly obvious, because a lot of coaches who aren't good at fourth down decision making are good at lots of other things. I mean, Mike Tomlin. Let's take Mike Tomlin, for example, right? Mike Tomlin is bad at fourth down decision making. He's great at locker room management and player motivation and things that we can't measure. So it's not like he's a bad coach. It's just there's this thing we can measure that he's bad at. But he's good at all these other things. So it's not like, oh, Pittsburgh's going to go 2-14 every year because Mike Tomlin can't make fourth down decisions. These are all little advantages. What we're trying here to do is to get little advantages.
So let's stay on the Steelers for a little bit, because I think you recently wrote something about how if the Steelers want to have actual Super Bowl aspirations, their offense needs to get it together. So from the research that you've done and from your vantage point, I think I'm as perplexed as everyone else on how they're 6-3. And now they have a legitimate shot to actually win the division with the Mark Andrews injury, Joe Burrow being, questionable. The Browns just lost Watson. So things are opening up for the Steelers, but how in the hell are they 6-3?
They're better than you think. Like, they're 12th in our ratings right now. My ratings, DVOA, wow. They're 12th right now. They're very good at not turning the ball over. And the fact is, turnovers are less predictive than yards, but they're pretty good so far at not turning the ball over and getting turnovers themselves. They have a strong defense. They're like 8th in defense. So they're not a great team, but they are not a bad team that happens to be 6-3. They're a 6-3 team, or maybe they're a 5-4 team that happens to be 6-3. Like, they're an above average team. Are
they favored to win that division?
No, Baltimore would still be favored to win that division. No tight end. Not even Travis Kelce is so important that he would make up what the difference is right now between Pittsburgh and Baltimore.
So let me ask you then, because you bring up an interesting point, saying, no tight end is important enough to kind of sway that difference. But in your years covering the NFL, the 20 plus years that you have experience, are there any positions that have really changed throughout the years that you've seen, or any positions? I mean, now we just talked about going for on fourth down. So now maybe a kicker is less valuable than before, right? If you're going for it more often, kicking less field goals. It's like, how has the game changed since you started watching and covering up until today?
If you go for it more often, your kickers and punchers are less valuable. But more importantly, the changes in the kickoff rules have made kickers less valuable, because kickoffs are much more predictive of future performance than field goals are. And they've taken almost all the value away from kickoffs. So now what you end up is this random variation on field goals, with like the exception of Justin Tucker. Obviously, when I started we argued that running backs were not as valuable as people thought they are, and they're less valuable now than they were then. And I think we've discovered, I don't know if inside linebackers are less important now than they used to be, but we have discovered they're less important than other positions, right? There is a hierarchy of positional importance in the NFL. And in general, the players that are related to passing are more valuable than the players that are related to rushing.
So your quarterbacks, your receivers, your cornerbacks, right? Those would be kind of at the top of that, of the
Offensive
food
tackles,
chain,
yeah.
right?
Even your best off-ball linebackers are the guys who are best at pass coverage. Fred Warner, Matt Milano, right?
Right. I'm a huge Fred Warner fan, huge 49ers fan, as we talked about before this
Right.
this interview. So anytime anybody mentions Fred Warner, I get a little excited. DVOA, you brought that up a couple of times. Can you explain, maybe for the listeners who don't know what that is? Can you explain what DVOA is?
Sure. Short version, we give every play a success value that's based on the down and distance, right? So obviously a 5-yard run on a 3rd and 1 is very different from a 5-yard run on a 3rd and 10. That success value gets compared to a league average baseline that is adjusted for situation and opponent and also normalized per year so that we can compare different years to each other without, knowing that there's a lot more offense now than there was when Dan Marino was playing in 1984, right? And it comes out as a percentage. Then we add on special teams, and it comes out on a percentage of how efficient you are above or below average.
And right now, currently in the NFL, I don't know if you have the list in front of you, but top 5 in DVOA, who would that be?
Baltimore is number 1. San Francisco is 2. Kansas City is 3. Why am I not remembering right now who's 4? Hold on 1 second, and I can tell you. Kansas City is 3. Detroit is 4. And Dallas is 5.
Interesting.
And it's different than wins and losses, right? I don't care about wins and losses, right? Wins and losses matter for the past. Bill Parcells used to say, you are what you are. And what he meant by that was, you are what your record says you are. That's not true. You were what you were. That is what is true. The Philadelphia Eagles are only 9th in DVOA, but they are 8-1, right? I can't take 8-1 away from them. They have 8 wins. I can't change that. I'm trying to predict how many wins they're going to have in the future. But nothing changes the fact that they have 8 in the past, and that puts them in better playoff perspective than Dallas, even though I think Dallas has been a better team this year.
So that's really interesting, because I've been telling everybody, I've watched a fair amount of Eagles games just because, being a 49ers fan, that I'm always looking at that one seed in the NFC.
Competition for playoff spots right now.
Right. Well, and Detroit now too, which before the year you would have told me that Detroit was battling for the 1 seed in the NFC, I would have said you're crazy. But I've watched a fair amount of Eagles games, and it's almost like the eye test tells me the same thing. Like, to your point, they are 8-1, but just watching them, I'm like, something is off with this team. Like, it's not the team from last year. And so you're an analytics guy, but I guess, how do you balance analytics versus the eye test? Just watching someone and saying, well, that person, maybe it's a specific player or team, they're clearly better than this other team, even though the analytics might say something else. Or do you typically give the analytics an edge over the eye test?
Everybody uses analytics and the eye test. Everybody uses both things, right? All we're doing is making the stats that you use much better. When they gave LaDainian Tomlinson the MVP because he led the league in rushing touchdowns, they were using stats, right? We're just making for much better stats. But yeah, eye test. Do I really think Philadelphia is the 9th best team in the league? No, I think they're like the 6th best team in the league. But what DVOA is telling you is they're not the 1st best league team in the league. And a lot of power rankings out there depend solely on wins and losses. And they're like, the Eagles have the best record, therefore they must be the best team. But they're not the best team this year. Right now, the Chiefs, for example, are a better team. And you can see that in the fact that the Chiefs are favored to win on Monday night, right? Like, if people really thought the Eagles were a better team, the Eagles would be favored.
Right. I think that Monday night game is going to tell us a lot. I'm excited. Well, and also the Swifts. I don't know if you saw the news story. The Swifts are going to meet the Kelseys, so that's
Yes, yes. I
exciting. I mean,
jokingly
just
said on another show that's why my favorite bet of the weekend is a Travis Kelce anytime touchdown scorer because he wants to impress the Swift parents.
listen. As someone who has Travis Kelce on their fantasy team, I'm rooting for the same outcome. um, Aaron, I wanted to touch on this point, so I did a little bit of digging. And there's a chart out there which correlates DVOA with the Super Bowl winner. And so
Yeah,
I'll just
it's
throw this
not
out at
good
you
in
real quick.
recent years.
It's not. And so that leads me to the question, but let me just throw this out. So I think between 89 and 93, the 49ers were first in, or it was 90, between 90 and 93, the 49ers were first in DVOA and had won the Super Bowl. In the past, let's say 10 years, only two teams have been first in DVOA and have won the Super Bowl that year. That was the 16 Patriots and the 13 Seahawks. From your perspective, that leads me to my question of, has the game become less predictable, or
A little bit.
how do you interpret that?
Yeah. Any other advanced stat, by the way, you get the same result. Any other advanced stat, you will find that the top teams in the 80s and 90s won the Super Bowl more often than the top teams in the zeros and teens. So, yeah, things have gotten a little bit less predictable. What you end up with is a lot of teams that rank between 2 and 6 that win it all. But you also have years like the 2007 Giants and the 2012 Ravens, right? And you have teams like the 2008 Arizona Cardinals. But it's still top teams generally win it all. It's just for some reason the number one team, and this goes for point differential, and this goes for EPA, this goes for any advanced stat, that the top team has tended not to win in recent years.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. I forget, you said the top team
Also,
right now in
sometimes
DVOA.
the top team wins if you add in the playoffs.
Mm,
The top team of the regular season doesn't win, but the top team with the playoffs included wins.
right, right. Interesting. Well, listen, my Niners are 2 right now. So if what you're saying is true, I guess maybe not being the top DVOA is actually a blessing in disguise. So we'll see how it turns out.
Yeah,
Um,
well, especially if you're the Ravens and you have their injury history, right?
right, right. You predicted last year that the Eagles were going to come out of the NFC. I
Yep.
believe you had predicted, was it Eagles Bills? I'm forgetting now.
I think I
As your
predicted
as
Eagles Bills last year. Yeah.
And the Eagles made it. Bills are close. This year, I believe you predicted 49ers Bills.
Yep.
And so what do you base those predictions off of? And second of all,
Oh.
kudos to predicting the Eagles last year. That I don't think anybody had the Eagles making it that far.
Yeah, I've gotten 5 of the last 10 Super Bowl teams correct. So we do preseason projections, and they're based on the DVOA of the last 3 years and personnel change variables and coaching change variables and certain stats like takeaways that tend to regress to the mean. And then we simulate the season. So there's an element of schedule strength in there, and it predicts the likelihood of certain teams winning. And we had Dallas as the top team in our preseason projections, but I just felt a little bit more comfortable going with San Francisco. Like you said, you have to use a little bit of subjectivity when you make your own personal predictions. So that's why I picked San Francisco and Buffalo rather than Dallas and Buffalo.
What do you think has gone wrong with the Bills? I mean, we just mentioned them.
Injuries.
Injuries.
I mean, the biggest their offense, except for the last game against Cincinnati, their offense has been fine. It's not as good. It's not as good as it was early in the year, but from week 5 to week 9, I think they were third in offensive DVOA. So until the Bengals game, they were fine. The defense has been the worst in the league over the last 5 weeks, 6 weeks, including the Bengals game. The defense has been the worst in the league. They have Milano hurt, Daquan Jones hurt, Tre'Davious White hurt, and Von Miller has not come back and been Von Miller. So just too many injuries on the defensive side of the ball has killed them.
You also, I think you were quoted before the year saying that it's going to be hard for the Patriots to go 4-13 because Belichick is such a good coach.
Turned out that was
what
wrong.
has gone wrong. Okay, so what is it? Is it Belichick's fault for what's happening to the Patriots? Is it Mac Jones? I mean, what's
Partly,
going on with New England?
it's all part. I mean, it's partly Belichick. I mean, first of all, Belichick, the GM, we know is not as good as Belichick, the coach. But the team does things like that are not indicative of a team that has good coaching. They have bad special teams, for example, right? But Belichick's special teams were great for years and years and years. Now they're bad. They seem unprepared for opponents. They seem unprepared for situational football. Like, it's very weird. Like, it doesn't seem like a Belichick team at all.
If you were Robert Kraft, what would you do with
I would
Belichick?
try to trade Belichick to another team and get draft picks.
Do you
I
believe
think
in
it
the
is best.
Chargers?
It is
The
best
Chargers
for a new
rumors,
start. Commanders.
Commanders.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would want him in the other conference because I
Mhm.
still think Belichick can be a good coach, but I think that sometimes, even with a good coach, things stagnate. That's what happened with Andy Reid in Philadelphia. It's not that Andy Reid stopped being a good coach, right? I would either try to convince Bill to retire, or I would try to trade Bill to Washington for draft picks.
Interesting. I just read a piece. Funny enough, I randomly found it on the internet from Grantland from Bill Barnwell
Who
talking
used to write
about
for me, actually. Got to start writing for me.
right. He wrote a piece back in 2015 on a coach by the name of Dan Campbell, who had just taken over as the Miami Dolphins interim head coach after a 1-3 start. And he wrote this amazing article on essentially the lack of success for interim head coaches, where when they get their full-time gig, it usually doesn't pan out. I think historically they have like a 46% winning percentage. Funny enough, the only coach that kind of broke that was Jeff Fisher, which for all the backlash that Jeff Fisher got, I think he had a winning. I think he was like a 55% winning percentage after his interim head coaching gig. So, but in that piece, I bring it up because in that piece, he talks about, I mean, back in 2015, he talks about Bill Belichick being fired. Now he's one of the, best coaches of all time. He talks about Ron Rivera not working out for him at the beginning. Dan Campbell is an example, right? Where it didn't work out for a long time. Now he's favored for coach of the year. So to me, it's just interesting to see how that kind of plays out throughout the years where, like you said, maybe a coach becomes stagnant with the team and all he needs is a fresh start somewhere else. And then he picks it up. And
With Belichick, there was a little bit of learning how to deal with the media and a little bit of the luck of getting Brady and a little bit that you cannot blame him for the 1995 Cleveland Browns because they pulled that team out of town and then they made them play the rest of the season with their crowds booing them and nobody knowing what the future was. And it was just a freaking mess.
all right, Aaron, I have to ask you, I hope you don't hate me for this question, but I just have to ask you, Brady versus Belichick, who was more important to those
I'd say
Patriots, to the Patriots dynasty?
60% Brady, 40% Belichick. But people now want to argue it was 100% Brady, and that's just stupid. That's
Right.
just stupid. Like, if you look at the early championships that were really driven by defense and special teams, 2001 and 2003 especially, Brady didn't become Brady until 2004, right? So it's likely if there's Brady without Belichick, he wins a couple championships. And if there's Belichick without Brady, he wins a couple championships. But it was having both of them together that allowed you to win 6.
The perfect marriage.
Yeah.
Speaking of Brady, that leads us to MVP talk. And you are a MVP voter. And I am inherently very, very curious about this. And so I wanted to ask you, what goes into voting for MVP? Like, what do you look at? And just in general, like how is that experience having, I'll call it a privilege to be able to vote for who the NFL MVP is.
Yeah, it is a privilege, and I'm very lucky that they chose me to be on the panel. I really was the first analytics person put on the panel. Now there's a couple of us, like Sam Bonson from PFF. I try to judge who's the most valuable player. Look, I'm generally a believer that the quarterback position is simply more valuable than any other position. The MVP has to be a quarterback, right? We we have awards for other positions. They're called Offensive Player of the Year and Defensive Player of the Year. Those are the awards for the other positions. MVP is the quarterback award at this point. You have to account for the value of the scheme and the teammates when you are judging the quarterback situation, right? Like Brock Purdy may have the best stats, but you ask yourself, who would do more, Mahomes in Purdy's situation or Purdy in Mahomes' situation? I think we would all agree that the answer is Mahomes in Purdy's situation would do more. It's tough. This is a tough year. There is no clear number one candidate. CJ Stroud is actually the number one passer in my values right now, but I've seen other values that have him lower. Some values have Purdy number one, but you have the problem with Purdy that you also have with Tua Tagovailoa and Jared Goff, right? Which is determining how much is them and how much is what is around them. Mahomes hasn't really done anything to be worthy of MVP. And Allen actually would have been my MVP pick until this week, and then he had a bad game against the Bengals, so that knocks him off of it. So this is a tough year. I'm hoping somebody comes in the next few weeks and differentiates themselves.
So let's talk about this for a second. The whole system, is it the system or is it the quarterback? You brought up Purdy, and that it seems to be a hot debate, especially at the beginning of the year. Was it the system that was making Purdy? Was Purdy just playing? Is he just a really good quarterback who happens to be with one of the greatest offensive minds in football, in Shanahan? Because I think you could also make the argument, like with Brady, who we just talked about, he was in a great system, right? He had a great offense. He had great weapons. And so there seems to be some sort of balance.
And Mahomes doesn't have great weapons other than Kelsey, but Mahomes has Andy Reid, right? Here's the thing. The award is not a valuable player. It's most valuable player. People want to diss Purdy and be like, oh, he's a replaceable. He's not. He's a valuable player. He's worth a lot more than that draft pick they originally used on him. But is he the most valuable player? If a guy is one of the 15 most valuable players in the league, you don't vote for him for MVP. You got to be one of the 5 best to get the MVP vote. And that's how I feel about Purdy and Tua and Jared Goff.
If you were starting a new team and you had to draft somebody with the first overall pick currently in the NFL, who would it be? Mahomes, yeah, I figured. I mean, is he the most talented quarterback we've ever seen in the history of the sport? Just from a pure talent, what he's able to do on the field, his arm talent, his ability to scramble, create plays.
It's hard. I don't want to not recognize the greatness of Brady and Manning. In particular, Manning. And the fact is, Brady and Manning, the intelligence and the ability to decipher defenses are all talents too. You don't need to be a scrambler to be a great quarterback. Not that Mahomes doesn't have. Mahomes also is a great decipher of defenses. Like that, that Mahomes is also brilliant. You don't play as well as he does without being very smart. So, I think if you go with the idea that that athletes constantly are getting more talented over time. That, Mahomes is probably the most talented quarterback to ever play in the league. But, Manning and Brady were great.
Yeah. I always remember.
With Brady and the work ethic, right? All 3 guys, right, have great work ethic. But Brady in particular, the work ethic was so strong that he overcame the fact that he didn't necessarily have as much natural talent as Manning and Mahomes. Like they're all, Manning's thing was deciphering defenses, and Mahomes is the ability to play out of structure, and Brady was the work ethic and the never, but they all 3 had all 3 things. Mahomes is great. Mahomes is the best now. Mahomes is the best now.
Right. Purdy is probably up there, right? Second, third, maybe all time, just in terms of talent. Right.
No. Josh Allen. I think people, despite the gunslinger mentality, I think most people would put Josh Allen second, and anybody who didn't put Josh Allen second would put a healthy Joe Burrow second. Yep.
Well, hey, Purdy at least has the whole best 262nd pick of all time. I mean, that's undisputed. So He at
Yes.
least has that accolade.
He has beaten
Um,
Marty Moore and Ryan Suckup as the best Mr. Irrelevant. Yeah.
right. Ryan Suckup. That's a name I haven't heard in a while.
Hey, Marty Moore
Aaron,
won a Super Bowl with the Patriots. So
right, right. Going back to MVP voting, you said that there's a panel. Maybe take us behind the scenes of, because I'm just I see the award every year, but the kind of behind the scenes, I don't think a lot of people know how many people are on the panel. Do you guys ever bounce opinions off one another, saying, "Hey, I think I'm going to go with this guy," or right? Like, what are some of those, I guess, conversations that happen?
it's 50 people are on the panel. And I've never really bounced my ideas off of any of the other people, even though some of them are friends of mine. Some of them are more like TV type people or former players who are commentators now. And then there's this new analytical group that has been started over the last couple of years, where you started with me on the panel, and now you have Mina Kimes, and you have Doug Farrar, and you have Sam Monson. But even though Doug and I are really good friends and he used to write for me, I mean, last year was his first year on the panel, and I didn't email him and ask him who he was voting. I did all my voting on my own. So, as far as I know, we don't meet in a room. It's very different. People have to understand that the MVP All Pro voting is just we get an email, we pick our players, and we email them in. Hall of Fame voting is a different panel of people that are more specifically from specific markets, and they meet in a room at the Super Bowl and talk about which players should make the Hall of Fame. It is a very different voting experience than the All-Pro MVP voting. And I would love to be on both panels, but I am not.
And so, how do you get selected for MVP vote? Do you just get a letter from the league saying, "Hey, Aaron"?
I just got an email saying, we have an opening on the panel and I would love to have you on, and we would love to get an analytics. I got an email from AP and they were like, we would love to get an analytics voice on the panel, and would you like to do it? And I said, I would be amazingly honored to be one of the people who chooses the all pro teams and the MVP and everything. So yeah.
You mentioned LT.
And it was important to me when I left Football Outsiders. I even emailed them and said, I just want to make sure that I'm going to keep my space. Like, that's very
right.
important to me. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned LT. Is there somebody in recent years who won MVP who you think there was somebody better out there who should have won it instead of that person? Or like, is there, I don't know. I guess as fans, there's always drama.
I'd have to go back, but because of the way I generally believe that quarterback is the most valuable position, I probably would not have voted for Adrian Peterson.
Right. Right. So you're telling me Christian McCaffrey
I
this
think
year.
it would honestly be easier if they came straight out and just said, MVP is for quarterback. Do not vote for quarterbacks for Offensive Player of the Year. The idea of voting for a quarterback for Offensive Player of the Year makes no sense to me. Either a quarterback is the best offensive player, in which case he's the MVP and they should not have two different awards. Or the reason they have two different awards is because you're supposed to vote for the other positions for Offensive Player of the Year. So I would like to see them differentiate, make it clear that Offensive Player of the Year is not for the idea that you vote for one quarterback for MVP and a different quarterback for Offensive Player of the Year is stupid. And I'd like to see a Special Teams Player of the Year award.
Who would that be for you this year so far?
I'm not sure. I don't have my numbers in front of me. Maybe Tommy Townsend. I don't know if he's been quite as good as he was last year.
Right.
Tucker is always a candidate. Marvin Mims has been really good. Historically, Denver always has bad special teams because what they end up with is they have below average punting and below average kicking that they think is good because of altitude, because they don't understand the effects of altitude. This year, they have average punting and average kicking and this great return guy, so they're actually number 2 in special teams right now.
Wow. I never thought about that. Yeah, that's very true. I was reminded of that Chargers. What was it, 2010 or 11? That year when they had the number one offense and the number one defense.
Led the league in both yards for and yards against, and they didn't make the playoffs because their special teams were among the worst ever.
And so, are there any? What are some analytics that you look at for special teams? I mean, obviously you have the field goal percentage, stuff like that.
Yeah,
but is there anything deeper that you look at?
Special
Okay.
teams DVOA is for field goals. It's the likelihood of making a field goal from different distances, right? So a field goal you make from 62 is worth like 2.5 points, but a field goal that you make from 35 is only worth like 1 point because you're expected to make it a certain percentage of the time. And then I adjust for weather and altitude. And then for punts and kickoffs, I use an expected points added type metric where, like, for example, for kickoffs, it's what is the average gain in expected points added from a kickoff. And for kick returns, it's what's the expected points added based on where you catch the ball on a return. And I try to filter out parts of special teams that are not predictive at all. So, for example, I don't look at field goals against you. I don't look at kickoff distance against you. I don't even look at punt distance against you. And I don't include massive plays like blocks because they are non-predictive. That doesn't mean lucky. Lucky and non-predictive are two different things. Fumble recoveries are generally lucky. Blocked kicks are non-predictive. They are so rare that they don't predict whether you will block kicks in the future. But they take a lot of practice and a good play call and a player making a play, and they're not lucky.
Lucky versus predictive. That's interesting. I never thought about that. Can you expand on that a little bit more? You said fumble
Yeah,
recoveries are lucky.
When these players work really hard to do certain things, I don't want to be like, well, that's just luck. I mean, certain things involve more luck than other things and more randomness. There's certainly more randomness and luck in creating fumbles than in yards, right? But there is some skill in creating fumbles. Some guys are just good at punching that sucker out. There's no skill in pouncing on it. That is just totally random.
Right. Wherever the ball falls, however the ball bounces, that's kind of what it is. Interesting. What is we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. If you would have told somebody back in 2003, hey, this is what NFL analytics is going to look like in 2023, they probably would have said you're crazy. We're now in 2023. What's your prediction for the next 5, 10, 15, even 20 years when it comes to analytics and where all of this is going towards?
Dude, I don't know. The amount of things you can do with the next gen stats, like we've only started to scratch the surface of what you can do with all that tracking data. And the teams have a better idea because they have all the data live during the season. Those of us on the outside don't have it. So I can't even answer that question. We're going to be able to do stuff 10 years from now that I would never be able to imagine right now.
Do you think that ultimately that would be better for the sport or worse?
I hope better. Analytics has made football a better sport. It's made baseball a worse sport, unfortunately. Because what we discovered in baseball was that the best way to play the game was to not worry about striking out a lot, but walk a lot and hit a lot of homers and not have a lot of station-to-station baseball on the bases, and that's boring. And they've had to do things like increase the size of the bases to try to inspire people to steal more bases because analytics said stealing bases was bad. Football, analytics has made it a better sport. Passing is more exciting than running. Going for it is more exciting than punting. Like, analytics has made football better, and I hope it continues to do so.
I know we've been talking about the NFL, but I have to touch on baseball just for a quick second. From your perspective, I mean, I think universally the pitch clock was a good addition, and I think it did help make the sport a little more exciting. But overall, it's a dying sport, especially amongst the younger crowd. How would is there anything baseball can do to revive the sport, or is it just a result of changing times and it kind of just is what it is?
Probably mostly it is what it is. I would move the World Series games a little earlier and try to appeal to kids a little bit more. And I would try to do things to change the percentages so that we reduce the value of 3 true outcomes baseball, where it's just walks, strikeouts, and homers. And they started to do that this year by changing the issue with the bases to make stolen bases more likely. And so you end up with Ronald Acuna having 70 stolen bases, which you wouldn't have had over the last few years. So that's good. I mean, I won't go back to having sacrificed bunting, but you want to go back to having more doubles and triples. And I don't know how to do that. Also, I would not take a team and move them to a city where you have to build a dome stadium because it's 110 degrees every day and the stadium won't be built for another 4 years. So maybe they have to play in Sacramento for a while. And I would not do that. I think that's dumb.
Not a good idea.
No.
Listen, being from the Bay Area, I know that Oakland has a lot of really passionate fans. And again, I'm a Giants fan, but, I do feel sorry for those fans. And I think they was it that one game this year where they all came out to show that, hey, we do have fans. Like, we're here.
Yep.
It's just this team is poorly run and has been poorly run for.
That stadium is garbage. It was garbage for the Raiders and it's garbage for the A's. And here's the problem. It's not in the economic interest of cities to build stadiums. It's just not. All the arguments about how it improves economics around the state, it just doesn't enough to make it worth the amount of money you spend. It's honestly worth it for teams to spend the private money. Robert Kraft spent his own money on Gillette Stadium, and he has made, he got some infrastructure help and they expanded Route 1 a little bit, but he has made tons of money off that real estate. It has been totally worth it for him. The idea that Oakland should pay for that stadium, Mark Davis and whoever runs the A's, they should have paid for a stadium. But no, if Vegas is willing to just give them stuff, they're going to go to Vegas.
Right.
But that's, football and baseball are very different. Like football, you draw lots of fans from other cities who come because it's one game and it's on the weekend and there's only 8 or 9 of them in a year. Baseball is much more dependent on the fan base of that town. It's not a traveling sport in the same way that football is, where fans travel. They're just not going to have. But first of all, they need to build a dome, but they're not going to have enough fans in that market to really support. It's going to be the smallest stadium in the league. It's just a bad.
Right.
The Las Vegas Raiders are a much better idea than the Las Vegas A's.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's why you see so many, opposing fans at, Vegas games and LA games. People use it as an excuse to go on vacation, and, those teams happen to be in locations where, people want to go and see. And so that's a really interesting point. What is your hottest take for the NFL season so far? I know you love your hot takes, and I know on Twitter you're not afraid to throw them out there.
Having ice cold takes.
Right.
Philadelphia is not the best team in the league. I don't know. Is that my hottest take? Pittsburgh doesn't suck. Is that a hot take? I'm done driving the Buffalo bandwagon. So that's. Baltimore is one of the top teams of all time is a pretty hot take, but that's what my numbers say. Right. They ran a stat that if you go through the first 10 games of the season in the last 40 years, and you look at the 5 teams that were behind the least amount of time in the first 10 games, 4 of them are 10-0. And the other one was the Ravens being 7-3. Like, what's happened to them this year is just crazy. The fact is that they have stomped the living hell out of good teams. Detroit, Seattle, since Cleveland the first time. Like, they have won big games against good teams, and that is usually the sign of a dominant team. But then again, they were a dominant team in 2019, and then they lost the first playoff game. So what are you going to do?
Right. What's your current Super Bowl prediction? We talked about what it was at the beginning of the season, but now about a little more than halfway through, what would it be?
San Francisco and Kansas City. I just don't trust that Lamar Jackson can stay healthy.
That's the one team I do not want to see out of the AFC.
I think
given our history,
Baltimore is the best bet by odds. Mm-hmm. But if you make me pick a Super Bowl, I would say Kansas City. Kansas City would that Baltimore can't keep people healthy, and that Kansas City would beat them.
Yeah, that's the one team I don't want to see. I just get PTSD from that Super Bowl in Miami against Kansas City. We had that game. We were up 10. and we pissed it away. But all right, what are you going to do? So Aaron, we're coming up on an hour here, and so I figured we'd wrap up with a couple of more questions. You've been, just tremendous amount of success in your field, with analytics, with sports journalism. Are there any frameworks or kind of, we talked about models for analytics and for football, but any mental models or frameworks that you use in your personal life that have played a role in propelling you to where you are today?
I mean, be willing to do little things, be willing to work little jobs for small outlets to build yourself up, have a sense of humor, and be good to the people around you. One of the things that makes me proudest, I'm going to brag a little bit here, is that when I announced that I was leaving Football Outsiders a few months ago, a lot of people were like, Aaron Schatz is the nicest guy in the business. He's always helped me. And if you help people, they will help you back.
I love that. Our past guest was Trevon Edwards. He used to work for The Athletic. And his piece of advice was be present. And so we do this little thing on the podcast where, our current guest leaves a piece of advice for the next guest. And his piece of advice was be present. What does that mean to you? And maybe how do you apply that in your own life?
Don't worry about the past as much. Don't necessarily worry about the future. Do the things you need to do right now. Be in the moment, appreciate what you have rather than wanting more all the time, there's an element where I could have maybe built myself up to be bigger, but I value my free time. So, I try to be present in my life. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. You talked about some of the frameworks that you use, but if you have to leave one piece of advice for our next guest and you don't know who it is, so it could be anyone, what would that piece of advice be?
Be nice to everybody around you because you never know when you're going to need them to be nice to you. And be nice to the young people coming up, which will, people will appreciate in the long run and will also help teach them to be nice to the people who come up after them.
Right. We could all use a little more kindness in our lives. That's, especially in today's day and age, it's unfortunately seems hard to come by. So I love that advice and thanks for sharing. Aaron, as we wrap up, anything you want to plug? Where can people find you? Where can people check out your work?
Yeah, if you don't know, right, I'm on Twitter and Threads at ASchatzNFL. That's ASCHATZ NFL. I'm also on Blue Sky. That's just ASchatz. The DVOA stuff is now at FTN Fantasy, even though it's not strictly for fantasy football purposes. FTNFantasy.com/DVOA is where you find things. The basic DVOA ratings are free, but for all the splits and all the historic data that goes back to 1981, you'll need a subscription, either a Stats Plus subscription, which just gets you my stuff, or a Fantasy Plus subscription, which also gets you Jeff Radcliffe's fantasy projections and a bunch of advanced matchup data for fantasy football purposes and some charting data from FTN data and a lot of really cool stuff. So you want to check that out, ftnfantasy.com/DVOA.
And all of those links will be in the description of this podcast. So if you're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast, check out the description. All of those links will be on there. I was joking around with Aaron. I realized that I had been reading his work for a while, but was never formally following him on Twitter or on his other sites. And so I made that change, but highly, highly recommend his content, especially on Twitter. A lot of ice cold takes and a lot of fantastic stats to help you out. And it certainly helps as a fan to read some of those. Aaron, I did lie. I had one last question for you and I just remembered it. Do you know off the top of your head, best team ever by DVOA? Who was that?
If you are looking for the regular season only, by the new version of DVOA that I created a couple months ago, the best team ever was the 2007 Patriots. If you want with the playoffs included, which I think is what people really mean when they say best team ever, it's the 1991 Washington Redskins. although my numbers do not go before 1981. So I don't have the 70s Steelers and I don't have the 60s Packers in there.
Wow. All right.
But people do not
There you
realize
go.
just how good 1991 Washington was. They were a tremendous team, all-around team. Offense, defense, and special teams were all top three. 14-2, lost the last game because it didn't matter for the playoffs anyway. Whipped their way through the playoffs. Fantastic, fantastic team. Third best team ever is the 1985 Bears.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Aaron, thanks so much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation. Wishing you the best of luck in all your future endeavors. And thanks again.
All right. Thanks for having me, man.